Thank you for joining us today for this webinar about understanding your carbon emissions. Before we get started, we'll just talk through briefly what we're going to go through. My name's Rory. I'm the head of sustainability here at Recora.
My name's Lauren and I'm the Sustainability Executive here at Recora.
And just today, we're going to, like I said, understanding your carbon emissions. We're going to kind of set the scene around climate change, really look into net zero, what it means, then do a deep dive into scope 1, 2, and 3, then look at kind of the role waste management plays, and then finally look at what you can do more personally, what you and we can do personally to reduce our carbon emissions. So, like I said, just get started, and we're going to start with a bit of a poll. So just you see this map here, and it's a map of London, and there's red highlighted area. So in the poll, if you can just say whether you live in the live or work in the red area. So just if you do live or work in that red area, then please just say yes or no. And then once you've done that, we'll go through and we'll have a look. I gotta have some poll. Have a look and talk about what this map means. So we've got here around 55% of people, around 50% of people either live or work in this red area. And what this map shows is this is a NASA prediction for areas of London that will either be underwater or that will be at severe threat of flooding in 2030. And for us, we are there at that green dot, and we are very much in that zone. 2030 will come up a lot that date, and you might think that's quite far away. I often think it's quite far away, but then in reality, it's only 6.5 years away. So any sort of changes we want to make and things need to be start putting into practice now, because things take a long time to happen and to take effect. So 6.5 years is not a very long time in the grand scheme of things. And I know I'm probably preaching to the converted because you've joined this webinar today, but just a few more maps. That map graph at the bottom shows you the years and whether they were above or below the average temperature. And you can see on the right-hand side that the years are getting warmer and warmer. Even though we're in the heart of summer now, when we're not necessarily getting the weather and the temperatures that we hope for. I'm sure you're all aware of on the news how most of mainland Europe was dealing with wildfires. In Hawaii at the minute, they're dealing with wildfires. And just in the news recently, it was announced that in June, the world's hottest temperature on average, so the Earth was at its hottest point, and June was the hottest month on record since records began, and that has since been taken over by July. So July was then the hottest month ever on record. So, like I said, preaching to the converted, but just some sobering facts before we get started. So we want to talk about carbon emissions, but just to help us kind of navigate through this, because it's a very complex topic, we'd love to know kind of, do you have a net zero target? Does your organization have one? And if you're not sure, then do your best guess to know if you've got a net zero target or not, because this topic is very confusing. We'll do our best to navigate through it, but just if we've got a good base level understanding of kind of where our audience are at, then that'll hopefully shape what we do moving forward. So from the responses we've got so far, the vast majority of you do have a net zero target. So hopefully that means there's a bit of understanding, but then maybe you've got a target, but you're not sure how you're going to achieve that target and what actions you can take. So we'll touch on that as we go through. So what does net zero mean? Like I said, it's a complicated topic, and whenever you've got different terms, people understand them in different ways, and kind of what net zero means. Up here are some other terminologies and phrases that you might hear. So you've got carbon neutral on the left-hand side, and that broadly means that you have paid to offset your carbon emissions. So if you produce 10 tons of carbon, then you have paid to offset 10 tons of carbon. And when I say offset, carbon offsetting, that means that you have paid for a project or an activity that will reduce carbon that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So you paid for the installation of a solar field or solar farm somewhere that wouldn't have happened without that money, or a wind farm, or protected a forest area from deforestation. Your carbon footprint is the footprint of you as a person or your organization, what your carbon emissions are. And then there's some other terms there, but I don't want to get into them too much because I think it just muddies the water, and kind of want to focus on net zero. So the broad understanding of what net zero means is that, first of all, you've calculated your carbon emissions, so you know exactly what your carbon emissions are. And Lauren's going to talk through a bit more of how that's done in terms of the scope 1, 2, and 3. But the first aspect of net zero is calculating your carbon emissions. And then the second aspect is setting a target to reduce those carbon emissions. And reducing it, again, that's quite a broad term, but kind of it's broadly understood that you want to reduce your emissions, and the date being 2030, and you need to reduce your emissions by 50%. The reason for that is it is widely understood in the scientific community that we need to keep global warming to a minimum of a maximum, of 1.5 degrees. So if the Earth was to warm by 1.5 degrees, then it's understood that there won't be catastrophic climate events. So such as like the Greenland ice sheet will stay there, and there'll still be ice at the Arctic and things like that. But if we go above 1.5 degrees, then we'll reach a tipping point, and then there could be some major consequences that we won't be able to recover from. And in order to achieve 1.5 degrees, we as individuals, as businesses, as communities, as countries, as the whole world, need to reduce our emissions by 50% based on a baseline year of around 2018. So there are other ways of looking at it, and your organization might have a different target. You might have 30% reduction by 2030, you might set a year of 2040, things like that. They are variable, but broadly speaking, net zero is calculating your carbon emissions and then setting a target to reduce them. And then kind of finally, why are we talking about it today? Why have you given up your day to listen to this webinar? And kind of, let's say 5 or so years ago, these sort of conversations were happening, but they were maybe once a quarter with a small group of people would be talking about it. It would be on footnotes in different reports and kind of things that we will do in the future. Well, now that future is the present day, and it's not just in that small groups of people's reports and on their desk, it's now on everyone's table and desk. Everyone is being asked about it, and it's only going to become more and more prevalent. So I want to thank you for listening today and trying to understand more about carbon emissions, because I think it's important that everyone does have a baseline understanding of what it is. So whenever those conversations happen, you know a bit more about it and are able to act on it. So I'm just going to hand over to Lauren now, who's going to talk around carbon calculations.
Yeah, so with scope 1, 2, and 3, I'm sure these are terms that most of you have heard of in the past few years, probably more so now. But it's interesting to know that a lot of people don't actually really know what scope 1, 2, and 3 means. This is certainly something I've heard a lot, but I don't always hear people talking about in depth. So we're just going to cover the basics of it so you understand what it actually means and why it's important. So this is to do with carbon calculations. So this was first formed in 2001, and scope 1, 2, and 3 forms the basis of greenhouse gas monitoring within the UK. So it allows companies, and even on the individual level, to understand or compartmentalize their carbon emissions. So it allows you to segregate them down a little bit, to understand and identify what's actually producing those carbon emissions within the company or on the individual level again, and how you can actually measure them, because measuring is the key here. So if we move to scope 1. So scope 1 includes your direct emissions. So this is fuel that your company is directly responsible for because they have direct control over it. So by company facilities, we mean things like oil and gas for heating, fuel for company cars, so gas for company cars, or fuel for company equipment. So things that your company is directly responsible for in terms of the fact that these fuels are directly burned. So that is scope 1. So fairly simple. Moving on to scope 2. Scope 2 is classed as indirect because your company will be purchasing the energy, but it isn't necessarily responsible for generating it or its emissions. So that will include things like cooling, heat, electricity, and steam. So again, fairly simple, scope 2. Scope 3, however, is where it gets slightly trickier because this is classed as indirect emissions. I'll explain a bit more about why. But it makes up 90% of an emissions footprint within scope 3 because there are so many different categories. So that will include things like your operational waste, your business travel, whether employees are traveling to work by train or walking or cars, capital goods, and fuel and energy. So if you're a company that is more specifically selling a good or products or services, once it leaves that premises or once it leaves the company won't have direct control over what happens to it in the future or its end of life phase, for example, but it will still be indirectly responsible for it because that's where it's originated from. So the company will still have responsibility for ensuring that they are monitoring these carbon emissions associated with these different sectors under scope 3. So it'll still be their responsibility. And obviously operational waste is a big one for us. So we'll be looking into that a little bit more. But again, these aren't things just to do with your company as a whole. It's things that, even though it's the responsibility of your company to look into and ensure that they're reducing emissions within scope 3, it is also obviously your responsibility as well as an individual to sort of take action and take it into your own hands. So whether you're already traveling by train or not, these are things that you will also be having to think about. Okay, so I'll pass back over to Rory.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. So now just using sort of waste as an example, just to go over those scope 3 and scope 1 and 2 ideas. So with waste and recycling, like we saw there, that fits into your scope 3. So the vehicles that come and collect your waste and recycling, that is your carbon emissions, but because you don't decide what vehicle comes and picks up your waste and recycling, that's in your scope 3. We do decide what vehicle we use, so therefore it's in our scope 1. Again, at our materials recovery facility, where it goes to get sorted and separated, we decide what fuel to use there and we burn that fuel, so therefore it's our scope 1, but it's sorting your waste and recycling, so therefore it's your scope 3. And then the final element is the end of life. So we at Record don't send anything to landfill, but if you were to send your waste and recycling to landfill, the carbon emissions that are associated with that would be your scope 3 emissions. So that's kind of just giving some examples of how it fits into those different buckets. But then also with waste and recycling, there's something that fits outside of the scopes, just to add another layer of complication to the whole scenario. But that's reprocessing. When you recycle, you are helping to avoid emissions somewhere else. So they're called net avoided emissions. By recycling a plastic bottle, it's a lot easier, a lot less carbon intensive to make a new plastic bottle out of that old plastic bottle than it would be to get it from raw virgin materials. So they're kind of net avoided emissions, but we won't talk too much about that because, like I said, that's just another added complication. And also with recycling, there are many other benefits, but we won't have time to go into them because we'll focus on the carbon today. So just to briefly talk about how Recor can help you with these carbon emissions, obviously this webinar today, but more in terms of as a business, how we can help you reduce your emissions, but also kind of as that net zero whole concept. So the first thing we spoke about was calculating. So we have a carbon report So we can calculate what your scope 3 emissions would be with regards to your waste and recycling, and we can provide those reports for you. We also have set our own carbon net zero target, and we are aiming to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030. And the way in which we're doing that is, like I said before, with our scope 1 is mainly the vehicles that we use. So we are trying to electrify our vehicles. We currently have 3 electric RCVs, so your normal bin vehicles on the road at the minute. We've got a couple of other electric vehicles. And also just next week, we are launching an e-bike service for SAP collections. So we're trialing that in just one area of London at the minute. And then hopefully over time, whenever that trial is successful, touch wood, we'll be able to launch that across London as well. So we're really trying to electrify our fleets and move away from the diesel vehicles. And then also we have our services. So like I said, with the net avoided emissions, the more you recycle, then the more carbon you can save further down the line. We have over 35 different waste streams. So we can, if you've got anything and you're not sure what to do with it, then please contact us. And I'm sure we'll have a way in which we can either repurpose that or recycle it. And finally, in terms of our services, we try and keep as much as we can in the UK, because there's no point in recycling something to save carbon emissions and then shipping it halfway around the world and shipping it back again, because then you lose those environmental benefits. And then finally, just kind of what else we can do. So myself and Lauren, we're part of the sustainability engagement team, and we try and work with clients as best we can to, it does exactly what it says on the tin, engage with our clients, engage with buildings and users of the waste and recycling within the buildings to make sure they're doing the best they can. But also we understand carbon emissions and want to try and help our clients go that step further. And in terms of these net zero targets, like I said before, they are appearing on everyone's desk. So please don't hesitate to ask us how we can help you impact your carbon emissions as well. So please lean on us and speak to us. And if there's any questions in this webinar, we'll have Q&A at the end, but also afterwards, if you've got any questions, then please don't hesitate to contact us. And we'll be more than happy to try and help you and support you in your net zero journeys. So now I'm just going to hand back to Lauren, who's going to talk about solutions to reduce your carbon emissions.
Yeah, thank you, Rory. So here are 10 key solutions to reducing carbon emissions, which I'm sure a lot of you have already seen. This is everywhere anyway, so all of this you already know and have seen. But I just want you to take a look at these numbers, and I would like you to select in the poll which ones either you are already taking action with, or things that you, on an individual scale, are already doing to help reduce your carbon emissions. So not necessarily to do with the company that you work with or the office that you work in, but at home as well. What are some things that you've invested some time or thought into in terms of how you can reduce your carbon emissions? So again, a lot of these things you may have been doing for a long, long time, but there might be some things that actually you haven't really put that much thought into, but maybe you've been thinking, oh, I might eat less meat this year. I think January is generally the time that people might be thinking of doing that, in the January. But again, we've got reducing food waste and loss. This is something that actually you might think people are doing, and there may have been a big shift in recent years towards reducing food waste. But it's surprising to know that around 9.5 million tons of food waste is lost every year within the UK. And this is still very much a very big problem when you actually think about the fact that we are still in a food poverty crisis. So it might seem very simple, but a lot of these things will have a very, very big impact. And again, this might be food loss in the office. When you think about how many people are throwing food into the general waste bin rather than having a food waste bin, for example, where it can go to a proper facility like the one we send it to. Again, it's those small things, small changes that you can make in your day-to-day lives, things that you make, the decisions that you make on a daily basis. So, for example, if you often take the tube, that's great. but maybe think about walking for a few stops rather than taking it the whole way. That will also help you as well. So yeah, just gonna have a look at some of the answers. But again, hopefully you've already been thinking about a lot of these things anyway, but we just want to try and reinforce that although they seem quite basic, they will be making a huge difference. So again, in terms of decarbonising plastics, have you already switched your coffee cups, for example? We've done a lot of webinars in the past which have focused on these things and reducing plastics. But have you switched to your reusable coffee cup? Because we know that many of us in London still buy disposable coffee cups. So just those things to think about as well. So we just want you to kind of take that with you as we wrap up the webinar and think about that today as well. But otherwise, that will bring us to the end of the webinar. But we'd just like to remind you that all of these things will help us feeling secure, especially for myself and Rory, knowing that we won't have to row to work. We can still get the tube and walk in. So please do have a think about these things that we've mentioned in this webinar. We hope it's been useful for you. We will address the questions as well that you put into the chat. Sorry that we weren't able to respond to that. We will do that now. So if you do have any other questions about anything we've talked about in the webinar, we will take a look at those now.
There's a question on why there's a risk of flooding, and that's just because as the sea levels rise, because of ice melting, but not necessarily the big reason. The big reason is that as warming temperatures, the sea expands, the warmer it gets. So therefore, as the temperature increases, more water it expands. So therefore, London that's got a big river running through it will then mean that it's more likely to flood in those areas. And London's not alone. I think Miami, there's some scary facts around Miami in Florida and how much of that can be underwater in a very short period of time. Countries in Southeast Asia, Bangladesh is under sea level, is the countries, the vast majority of it is under sea level. So therefore, any sort of sea level rises there will have a big impact on the population there. So where we are currently in terms of degrees of warming, so we're currently at 1.3 degrees. Oh, we've got 1.2, 1.3 degrees of warming at the minute. So we are at squeaky bum time, let's say, in terms of trying to hit that 1.5 degrees. A lot of news came out recently that there's an understanding that maybe 1.5 isn't achievable, but I don't like that sort of news because then people might just pack up their bags and say, well, what's the point in trying if it's not achievable? And I'd rather stay with the hope and optimism and keep trying to do the actions that we've spoken about today, and then we will be able to hit it.
With us, help with education engagement. Yeah, Nick, that's definitely something that we can help with as a team. As Rory mentioned earlier, engagement is something that we do a lot of throughout the year with clients. So if that's something that you would like to have a bit more of on site, then we can definitely help you with that. It also allows people to ask as many questions as they need in terms of like home recycling as well. So we can go over that with you by email. And we can just kind of give you a list of the things that we can offer in terms of engagement and anything that you think might be of interest. So yeah, that's definitely something we can help you with. How much does waste contribute to companies' carbon emissions? So waste contributes to around 15% of your carbon emissions deriving from the company. So waste contributes to around 50% of that, of the overall carbon emissions produced.
And coffee grounds. So coffee grounds, we do like them to be separate from food waste because they're sort of a different material. So ask where would you put coffee grounds? We have a coffee ground waste stream. We also have a food waste stream. If it goes in the food, in the anaerobic digestion system, that system doesn't really like it and they don't really break down as well. But if they're collected separately, then we can dry them out, release all the oils and things from them, and that's often used in the in lots of makeups and different healthcare system. And then the dried out coffee can be turned into coffee pellets or coffee logs, and because they've got such a high calorific content to them, it means that whenever it's burned, they can burn very hot and very bright. The flood risk and impact on transport, homes, workplaces, where we can get impact information on goods and services in daily life. I'm not sure in terms of flood risk if there's information available where if this was to happen, here is what actions you should take. I don't know about that. Do you know anything about that,
I
Lauren?
think the councils tend to focus on high risk areas, and providing information to areas where people are located or people who are specifically vulnerable. So it will be usually up to councils to provide that information if it does pose a threat. But otherwise, I think it tends to be fairly tricky to find this kind of information because it would be very specific to where you're living as well, as already mentioned earlier. Impacts on daily life. Yeah, again, I think this would just kind of play into the council's role in providing that information time. But you don't tend to see a lot of this just sort of advertised around.
No. Is Recora using 100% renewable energy? We do use 100% renewable energy. We, through our energy supplier, is 100% renewable energy. And but our fuel use for our vehicles and some of our heavy plant machinery at our yard is still using diesel fuel until we fully electrify everything. So our energy supply is renewable, but then our machinery is still using diesel.
Are there any other questions? Some good questions there, though.
Yeah. And we'll send out the presentation and the slides and a recording of this. So please send it to whoever you think will find it useful. And if you have any follow-up questions or thoughts, or you've spoken to colleagues about it and they've had any questions, then like I said before, please don't hesitate to ask us. We want to make sure we engage and help as many people as we can. Touch on the carbon reports is something we can ask for chat about separately. In terms of our carbon reports, yes, please speak to us separately about it, Laura, but to summarize, they are carbon reports that we can provide on a monthly, quarterly, annual basis that tell you based on what waste and recycling we've collected over that period of time. Here are the carbon emissions associated with that. So here are your scope 3 carbon emissions, and here are also your net avoided emissions, and we can provide you a report with that. But yes, if you want to learn more about that, then please contact us. Okay, well, there's no more questions. Thank you all for joining us today. The carbon reports are not available on the portal at the minute. That is something we're working on, but they are not available on our portal at the minute. They need to be sent separately. We're working on that at the minute. Yes, thank you for joining us and these webinars. And yes, we'll be doing another one next month, so please look out for that. And yeah, thanks again for joining us, and please get in contact if you have any follow-up questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.